Hey, this is Wes McDermott. Welcome to the fifth video in Chapter 2. In this video, we're going to take a look at the inspector. We're also going to talk about tags and layers. So we've actually covered the inspector quite a few times in some of the previous videos, but now we're just going to dive into it just a little bit more. So one of the main things that you'll use the inspector for is to change parameters on objects that you're working with. So for instance, here we have this crate medium selected, and you can see here in the inspector we've got some components that we can actually work with. Now, as we've learned, that the inspector has a transform to it. So again, we have basically a numeric entry for our position, rotation, and scale, and then beyond that we actually have some components that add to this guy that basically make this game object what it is essentially. And then we've also talked about how the inspector is really just context sensitive. So for instance, I've got this object here. If I select this camera, you can see that it's going to update with what components and things like that is attached to. But where it really changes is if you actually select something completely different, like in our project browser. So for instance, let's just go over to our project browser and select this crate medium. Let's actually find that model first. So let's just scroll up to the top and let's come over here to all models, and let's just grab a model here, this Babel. So at this point you can see that our inspector now has completely changed to work with this model import setting. So if we import a model in from our 3D application, once we get that into Unity, we can select that model, and then there are some things that we can actually change in this inspector. And these actually become pretty important. So for instance, if you're bringing in a mesh, you can do a couple things. So for one, we've got this model tab here as part of our inspector, and we can change the scale factor. So once we bring this into Unity, what's the actual scale of this mesh going to be? So different applications use different scales. So for instance, I use Maya, and Maya, when you bring in your model inside of Maya, if you build it Maya's default units, if you want that scale to equal the same, so whatever the scale is set inside of Maya, you want that to look the same here in Unity, you would bring this model in and you would change your scale factor to 1 and click apply, and then you'd be set and good to go. You also have options for like mesh compression and how you're going to work with your normals and tangents and things like that. But as you can see, these settings here are very specific to what a model is. So with that same token, let's go over here and find ourselves a texture. Let's see, we got textures. Here we go. Let's pull this guy to the side, and let's just grab a texture here. So as you can see, again, we covered this a little bit in a previous video, but the big thing that I want to bring up is, again, as you can see how the inspector, it's context sensitive, it's now changed. So even though that once we're in the project asset, we select a texture at this point, our inspector settings for the texture are different. And again, these settings are going to be very specific to how you would work with the texture. So for instance, this is a normal map, so its texture type is set to normal. You could, again, change this to anything, a reflection map. This is a cookie for a light mask, so to speak. Here's a light map, just default texture. Again, if we change this over here to advanced, you can see that we get a couple different options here on how we might want to generate bitmaps, how we want our wrap modes and things like that going to be. Our import type is still here though, so even though we've changed this from saying I don't want to be a normal map but change this to advanced, it doesn't mean that we've actually changed that from it being a normal map. As you can see here, our import type is still set to normal map. And so we can also do things like change the linear space, to work with if you're working with HDR. But the other big benefit to changing this to advanced comes down into our compression. So here we've got our different platforms. So we've got default, standalone, and here's our mobile platforms here. If we were, let's just say that we picked iPhone, you can see that under advanced, we can then see we can actually change what compression. So do we want PVRTC, 4-bit or 2-bit and things like that? Let's look at what that would look like if we were just change this back to normal map. You can see that the format just says compressed, 16 or true. So it compresses it. I think it defaults to if you were using iPhone, it would default to the 4-bit, but you kind of lose a little bit of options that you might want to choose in the advanced. However, if it's not something that you think you're mess with, you can just leave this at the default texture type here, and then you can just go with what Unity is going to give you. So again, just to kind of hammer that home, the inspector will be context sensitive depending on if you're working in the scene, or really it entails to if you're working the project browser versus the scene. Okay, so here we're just going to revert again, as I mentioned in a previous video. If you make some changes into the inspector of an object from the project browser, it's going to ask you, do you want to apply these settings or revert them? Okay, so now let's go back to this guy. So we've got him selected. We're in our inspector. We've talked about our transform, so we know what this is. As you can see, this really does come into play because every single game object has a transform, which means it has a position in space. Then on this guy we have a couple components. We're not really going to go into all the components. We've covered that in a previous video, but as you know that you've got components. If you're working with a 3D object and you have a material, sometimes if you don't see any settings for your material, if you just click the little swatch here that kind of gives you a little preview, you can see that you have some slots here to actually add texture maps and things like that and make some changes to your shader. Now that all depends on what the shader is. So if we kind of click this drop down, you can see that a lot of these are the default Unity shaders. This Angry Bots demo actually has some very specific custom built shaders, and that's what we're seeing here. And if you want to change any of the textures, all you got to do is just from your project browser, just left click, drag and drop, and place those into these texture slots. And then you can make changes to the tiling and what textures are used and things like that. So that's, again, the inspector has the transform, and then actually you add components to that. One more time just to iterate, we can click add component, and you can see that here's the list of all the components that we could add to this guy. So what I want to talk about now is this area up here, which we haven't really covered in any of the previous videos. So we've got a section here for prefab, and then we've got tags and layers, and then we've got this static button here. So let's just start with prefabs. So I can tell, like, right off the bat, this guy here is a prefab, and so and we know that because we've looked that up here in the project browser before. So with this guy selected, I'm just going to click the select button, and what that does is you can see that I click select, and it comes down to our project browser, and we can see that we've got our assets, prefabs, props, and this create and barrel. So this guy right here, this create medium, is a prefab, and so I'm just going to left click and drag here in our preview window so we can see what we have here. But this object was created as a prefab, which means it's a prefabricated Unity element. It's basically it's an object that we can instance throughout our game. And if we want to make a change to this prefab and have it propagate to all the other objects in our scene, we can do that. So let's just say that we're working with create medium, and one of the things that could be a little confusing at this point is I've selected create medium. Okay, this create medium prefab, and then here in our inspector, the inspector looks very similar to what we were looking at when we selected here. So you can see that it almost looks identical. Let's go back to the prefab here. But what I do want to point out, again, remember the inspector being context sensitive, since we were actually selecting this prefab from within the project console. What we're actually looking at here is the inspector settings for this specific prefab. So as we start to change this guy, what we're going to do is we're going to be making a change to the prefab itself. And so we need to be aware of that. So let's go back and just in our scene view, let's select the actual item here in the 3D space. Now let's just say that we're working on this guy, and we decide, you know what? I don't want to use a box collider anymore. So the box collider is used in physics calculations. You can see that we have this green bounding box around this guy. That's what the box collider is. Let's say we're like, we don't want to use that. We want to remove this component. And now what I want to do is I want to add another physics component. And this time I want to use a mesh collider. So the mesh collider is actually going to be using the vertices of the mesh itself to provide the collision. So now we've changed that, but we've actually changed the prefab. So what we would want to do at this point is we would want to, we could do a couple things. We could actually revert this guy, so you could see that it goes right back to the box collider. So here, let's remove this again. Let's add this component. Let's come down to our physics here, and let's grab our mesh collider. And then let's go through. And now that we've added this mesh collider, we've made a change to this prefab. Let's go ahead and say we want to apply this. So what this has done is we've made a change here in our scene view, and we've actually applied that change to our scene here within the, our prefab here within our project. So now you can see that if we come down and we select the prefab itself in our project, we can see that that mesh collider change that we've made has taken place. Okay, so one thing you'll notice here that I just paused the video, made a quick change. You notice that when I made that change, this object became highlighted, or it looked different. It looked like there was some kind of setting. So I'm not sure what really happened there. I must have changed something here on that setting. But what I ended up doing was I just went back and I did some undos and then just re-added that mesh collider, and everything was okay that time. So probably just a little glitch there, but just wanted to let you know. So as you can see, that changing a prefab and saving that down or applying that back to the scene shouldn't have any, unless you're making a dramatic change, but it shouldn't have done what it did. But anyway, so we got that fixed. So there's what our prefabs do. And again, just to reiterate that, how this inspector is context sensitive, and sometimes it can get a little confusing on what it is you're actually working with. So if it's selected, if you have your object selected here in the viewport, it's going to be reflecting that. If you have your object selected here in your project browser, the inspector is going to reflect whatever the object is selected. So it's kind of a really good rule of thumb there. Okay, so going back to our scene, we've talked about the prefab section here. The next thing that we want to do is talk about this tag and layer. So tags and layers are very important within Unity, and they're used often. And so what are they actually used for? Well, you can set a tag for something. So if I click this drop down, you can see that here are some tags and things like that, and I can add my own tags. And then I can actually do a layer, so I can actually place things on a layer. So why would you do that? Well, layers are commonly used as a mask, so to speak. So think about if you want to have your camera and you want only certain things to render from certain cameras. You can actually have multiple cameras in your scene. Maybe one camera is handling 3D objects, maybe another camera is handling all of your user interface objects and things like that. And you want to be able to tell one camera to only render certain objects and another camera to render another certain amount of objects in your scene. You can actually do that with layers. So you could place an object on a layer, and then you can do something like, let's say, go to our camera. Where is that guy? Let's just camera. Here he is, our main camera. So we could go over to our main camera, and you can come over to its culling mask, and you can see right now it's set to everything, so render everything. But you could say, well, I want you to render everything except for reflections, so I could turn that off. Now let me undo that for just a second. Let's go back to this object, and you can notice that they do have a layer selected. So they have a layer called reflection, and this is a layer, a custom layer that was created. Now, and we'll talk about how to do that here in just a moment. But notice that this object has been set to reflection. So again, if we come down to our main camera, right here in our scene, and if I were to say, okay, I want my culling mask. Right now it's saying everything, but if I say, hey, render everything except do not re-render reflections, I want you to watch what happens over here in our game view. So if we say, notice that the reflection layer has a check mark by it. If we just left click on this, you can see that here in our game view, that object is gone. So everything that has that reflection tab is no longer being rendered by our camera. And you can see that our culling mask is set to mixed. Let's go ahead and change this back to everything, and you can see that the reflective objects, or objects that have that reflection layer tagged here, basically, wouldn't be rendered, but now they are, since we've set that culling mask to everything again. So typically you'll use layers to, again, mask things. So mask what's being rendered by the camera. You can also do that by lights. So you could say, like, okay, I have certain lights in the scene, I only want them to illuminate these certain objects. You can place those on a layer, and you can do that same thing with lights. Another very common thing that you'll do with this is that with layers is that you can actually have, when you're casting rays into the scene to detect for collision, for example, you can actually test against certain layers. So you could say, I want to test against collisions, but only if the layer, only for collisions on this layer. So the raycast is only going to, you can only test for collisions through a raycast on objects that are on a certain layer. So it's a way of optimizing your game as well. So instead of just having to go through and do a raycast and have it run through every single collider that it have it to do calculations for every single collider that it hits, you don't have to do that. You can actually mask that with just a certain layer. And it's also a way of being able to say, well, look, if this only hits this certain layer, then do something else in my game. So they're very, very helpful. In the case of this Angry bots, they've kind of gone and done something a little different. So like I said, they've actually have reflection enabled here as a layer that they created. Now what they've done is they've actually created a script that actually uses this. And I believe if we kind of look through our project browser, I believe it's called Reflection FX. So if you ever want to take a look at the Reflection FX filter script, excuse me, we'll just double click and we can load this up here. They're actually utilizing layer masks as well. So if we just do like a really quick search here for layer, you can see that there's a private function here. What they do is they create a new camera that they're rendering reflections to, and it utilizes a layer mask. So basically what they're doing with this is they're using layers for this guy so that not everything in the scene is going to have this reflection applied to it, only certain objects. So they're kind of optimizing the scene by, instead of saying, hey, I want to just run this reflective shader on every single object, and have that camera, go ahead and have that calculated or rendered for that. What they're doing is they're using the layer to say, well, only do it on these certain layers that are masked as, or basically on the layer of reflection. So again, it's a way to optimize. So instead of doing it to everything, we're only doing it to objects that are on the reflection layer here. So we mentioned that we could make our own tags. Let's take a look at that. So if I do this drop down and I say add layer, or excuse me, I'm talking about layers here, you can see that we get this tag manager. And, the tags and the layers kind of go together a little bit. So you can see here we have tags. If we click this little drop down arrow, you can see that here's some tags. But anyways, we have some, these are built in. So basically layers 0 through 7 are going to be, what Unity creates. And then from here on out, so from 8 to 31, we basically have these slots, so to speak, that we can use to create our own. So let's just say, let's create ourselves a Unity cookie layer. So we've created that layer, and now what we're going to do is we need to go back to that object. So here in our viewport, let's just select this guy. And now you can see that layer is still set to reflection, but if I hold down this, bring up this context menu, you can see that we now have the Unity cookie layer here. So that's how you actually set that to a new layer. What you need to do is, once you go through and you add the tag, or excuse me, the layer or the tag, just adding it or creating it's not enough. You do need to make sure that you go back and set that. So that's one thing that'll kind of get you from time to time. You'll forget to set that. So it's kind of a two-step process. You create it and then you set it. So now that we've spoken about layers, let's now take a look at tags. So if I go ahead and just click this drop-down menu here, this context menu, you can see that we have several tags here. And tags are basically as a way to identify a game object, and you'll use these in scripting a lot. So like say if you want to have your script check if a game object is a certain tag, then I want to be able to do something with that or something, and that's mainly the way that I use it. One common tag is if we go to main camera, you can see that its tag is always set to main camera, and so whenever you create a new scene or Unity's main camera by default will always be set to this main camera tag, and that's so that at any point in time, just you can use the main camera tag to be able to do or check or write any scripts that work with the main camera, so to speak. But you can create your own tags the same way. You just go to the add tag here. Now this one, you do need to click this little drop down arrow, and right now it says size 4, so it's kind of like an array. So it's basically saying that tags are inside of an array, and you've got element 0, 1, 2, 3. If I want to create another one, I could say my tag. If I want to create additional ones, every time I create another tag, it's going to just automatically create another element for me, so I can continue creating these things, and every time I hit enter, it's just going to create a new element for me. So now you can see our tag size is 7, so we've got 7 custom tags in here. So again, we'll go back and you can see that if I click the drop down, here's these new tags that we created. And again, so what you'll do is you can actually tags are part of the game object. So within scripting, what you could do to get to that is you could say you can actually go and check that game object .tag to actually see what that tag is set to. And what I commonly do with that is I'll use these tags, like I said before, it's an identifier, it's a way to check things. So if I had several objects in the scene, and let's say that I want to have it to where the user can select one of these 3 guys. So let's just say, here's just a quick example. We've got this guy here. whatever these guys are, these little crates, and then we've got all three of these guys. So let's say that we put this guy at my tag, and this guy here is set to my tag 2, and this guy here is set to my tag 3. And let's just say that we create a script that when the user can actually click on one of these guys, and it's going to do, and when you click from the mouse, or from the camera, it's going to, shoot a ray out to the scene. It's going to hit this collider. It's going to return back what it actually collided with. And what you can do in your script there is you could say, okay, well, game object, just kind of pseudo code here. You can say, well, whatever that collider hit dot game object dot tag, if that's equal to my tag 3, then I want this to happen. Whatever that raycast hit collider dot dot tag dot my tag, if it's just my tag, then I want this other thing to happen, and so on and so forth. So you kind of get where we're going with that. Again, it's just a way to identify your objects, and you'll use tags mainly through scripts so that you can identify different objects from other objects and be able to do different types of operations on them. So that pretty much covers tags and layers. And if we kind of go on up here to the top, a couple more quick little things that we can do here. I'll actually move this guy down. We can do something kind of cool. So here is just a field where we can actually rename these guys. So if you want to rename this guy in the scene, since this is a prefab, so I can change the prefab itself. Remember, a prefab's an instance, so it's just going to change the name here in the hierarchy view. But one of the things we could do is, you could actually turn this guy on and off. So you can see that that's just basically on off. The other thing we can do is we can click this little icon here, this little drop down arrow, and we can actually change the icon to this. So let's just say that this is something that we want to identify in our scene, so we can actually change this to be red. Okay, and then what it's going to do is it's going to place here in my scene this little icon, or this little kind of indicator here that lets us see what that is. So this could be something that you use in your game. Again, if you have a really complex level with a lot of objects on it, it's just an organizational type thing. So you can actually change icons of this guys, and you can even create your own. So if I click other, it's going to go out to, it's basically going to bring up this little window here, which is really just my asset browser, and I could attach something to it. Like, what if we attach this rock normal map to it, so we could do something different like that. So if we pull this off, you can see here that that icon is now changed, and it kind of looks like that little normal map here. So if you were working on a team and you had a lot of complex assets and you wanted to create your own icons and things like that, you could do that. So we'll just turn that back to the default. And then finally, you have this checkbox over here. This is for static, and then we have this little drop down here, which is talking about what specific things we're going to make static. So what this means is it's talking about, is this object static? So what that means is the object is not really it's not animated. It's not moving in the scene. It's not animated through some type of animation you create on it, or it doesn't have any scripting applied that's going to be moving this guy around the scene at runtime. And so what you can do with that is there's two types of ways that you can do batching in Unity. You can do what's called static batching, and then you can do what's called dynamic batching. So dynamic batching, so the difference between the two, I'll say that static batching is only available on the Pro version. Dynamic batching, it works on the free version and the Pro version. And so like dynamic batching is basically little batch elements that are moving in the scene. So what that means is it'll basically take, if an object is sharing, if you have two objects, so let's just say that I were to duplicate this guy. So here on Mac, I'm just going to hit Command D, I think it's Control D on Windows, and I duplicate this guy. So now we have two objects. Both of these objects are sharing the exact same textures and materials. So these guys, as far as Unity's rendering engine is concerned, can be basically one draw call. So we have two mesh items, but since they're sharing materials and textures, they can be batched into one draw call. So it's optimized. Now, if this was set to dynamic, these guys could be moving or having some type of animation to them. Now, the caveat to that is dynamically batched items have to be less than 900 vertices. So you can see that dynamic batching works with moving objects, but there are some stipulations to when dynamic batching is going to work. So if the object is not going to be moving in your scene, you have the ability to check this box here and say, hey, I want this to be static, which means it can have as many vertices as you want, and you're basically just saying, hey, this object's not moving, and it will batch all these guys together. So for instance, we kind of zoom out, we've got this rock face area here. You can see that these guys are set to static, so this is obviously not moving. So all these rock objects, they're sharing the same materials and textures. They're marked as static. They're all going to be batched into one draw call. So it's just going to help the game be more optimized. And you also have the option here, if we kind of just click this down, we can say, is this light map static? Is it occluder? Is it batching static? These are just kind of more advanced settings for the static properties of these meshes. But for the most part, what you have here is the ability to turn this on and off. So if we were to take this and uncheck it, we're basically saying, hey, this item here is not static. And again, static is only available in the Pro version. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and close out this video. The real takeaways from this is that the inspector is going to be context sensitive depending on if we're kind of working our scene view versus our project browser. Also, the inspector is going to allow us to add new components. So we've got this component button, or we can actually go up to the top here and add components. It's going to let us be able to set things on our objects and basically change our transforms, or if we add components, we're going to change parameters and things like that. We can also go through and add tags to our objects, and we can set objects on certain layers. And then finally, we can actually change or check these objects to be static within our scene.